For those that don't know, as well as creating my online content during the day, I also do an evening/night shift at a bakery 6 days a week, and that obviously keeps me tremendously busy. But yesterday was a Wednesday, and Wednesday is the one day of the week that I don't upload any videos, not to my public YouTube channel and not to my Patreon account. So that's the day I tend to use to perform any kind of maintenance that I think is required as far as my online content is concerned. Most of you will know that I'm something of a stickler for order, so I like things to be organized properly. And so what I did yesterday is that I brought my YouTube playlists more in line with the content categories that are on my Patreon account. So if you go to my YouTube homepage, you'll see 4 playlists. The first playlist is for my experiential spirituality videos. The second playlist is for my religion videos, and my long-time subscribers will know why I draw a distinction between spirituality and religion, and if you don't know why I do that, then please do go and watch my experiential spirituality playlist, especially the first 7 videos of that playlist. And then you'll see my Mysteries of the World playlist, and finally my Empowerment playlist. The Empowerment playlist is for those videos that deal with worldly subject matters, and I'm generally trying to give people advice on how to contend with those issues. And so on my Patreon account, you'll find those categories with bonus videos and also additional categories that aren't really suitable for my public YouTube channel. So this video will go into my religion playlist, and honestly, it's been a long time since I made this kind of video on my public YouTube channel. For the last year, I would say, they have primarily been created on my Patreon account just because they're rather niche. There's not that many individuals that are interested in this kind of subject matter, but I really feel led to talk about this today, mostly because about a year ago, I did a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew and a commentary on the Gospel of Luke for my Patreon account. And I did those commentaries with the intention of doing a commentary on the Gospel of John, which is my favourite of the 4 Gospels. I didn't do a commentary on the Gospel of Mark because the Gospel of Matthew contains the majority of what Mark contains. It's just more elaborated upon. And I couldn't skip Luke because Luke is so unique in many ways. Even though it is one of the synoptic Gospels, Luke has so many unique parables and so forth. Now, I did actually do a commentary on the Gospel of John a few years ago, but that's been lost to time now. And even if it hadn't been lost to time, I really felt I could have done a better job on that commentary, and that's what I hope to do now. So even though life got in the way and I never got around to doing my commentary on the Gospel of John, my new commentary on the Gospel of John, I am going to start doing that this week, specifically tomorrow on my Patreon account, and I'm going to hopefully get one installment of that commentary online each Friday of the week on Patreon. But before I start doing that commentary on the Gospel of John, I want to talk about the scriptures of the New Testament more broadly, because there are some understandings that I think are very vital before you go into any kind of deeper understanding on any one book that the Bible contains. So we need to talk about the Bible more generally to begin with, because the moment you start earnestly talking about the content of the Bible, people tend to make certain assumptions. The first assumption they make is that you must be a Christian. I am not a Christian, although I used to be. I wasn't raised a Christian. I wasn't raised in any religion at all. Like most people here in the West, I was raised in a very secular household. They weren't opposed to religion, but it wasn't of any great interest to them. But I became a Christian after a spiritual experience that I had. I had a spiritual awakening that I then and now I attributed to Jesus Christ, and so it was natural for me to become a Christian at that point. The reason I ultimately left Christianity is because the more I studied the history of Christian theology and associated subject matter, the harder I found it to maintain any kind of perspective that would be regarded as orthodox. And what you find in Christian circles is that, unfortunately, Christians are always trying to argue one another out of the kingdom of heaven. And so I didn't want to be one of those people that was desperately fighting to hold on to this title of Christian against all these other people who were arguing that I couldn't be considered a Christian because I didn't agree with this and I didn't agree with that. I don't know why anyone would put themselves through that. So just to avoid those kind of debates and disputes. I don't consider myself a Christian at all anymore. In fact, I have more of a universalist perspective these days as far as spirituality is concerned, but I still love Jesus, I still love Yeshua, I still respect very much the content of this book here, and I have a lot of respect for the different Christian denominations as well. I make a point of studying not just the Bible, but every sacred text, because I think they all have something valuable to teach us, but I don't know any sacred text better than I do the Bible. And so today I'm going to talk about the New Testament, specifically how it is that the books of the New Testament came to be in the New Testament. But before I even get to that, I have to share some understandings about the Bible as a whole. You know, the thing is that when you've been studying these areas for so long, you forget how most people view these subjects. And so what I don't want to do in this video is assume any knowledge at all on the part of those watching. To most people, the Bible is just a single book. And the word Bible means book, so it's understandable they would have that perspective. But technically, the Bible is a compilation of books, and those books are divided into two categories, Old Testament and New Testament. And those that know that much will generally understand the Old Testament as being the Jewish scriptures and the New Testament as containing the Christian scriptures. Well, technically, every text within the Bible is a Jewish scripture in the sense that, as far as we know, they were all written by Jewish individuals. But it is true that the texts within the New Testament are exclusive to the Christian religion, typically. Not always, but typically. So that much is true. The problem is that if you approach the Bible as most people, and by the way, that includes most Christians do, and you assume that it's just a singular book, and more importantly, you assume that each of its authors was trying to say the same thing, it's going to be nearly impossible for you to really understand what the author of each text was trying to say, because most texts in the Bible were written by different authors, and they each have a different perspective on the subjects that they're addressing. If you assume that they're all trying to say the same thing, then you're going to commit what is called eisegesis, which is the opposite of exegesis. Exegesis is what you should be doing. It's where you read a text and you try to take away from that text what the author intended you to take away. You take away the author's perspective. Eisegesis is when you're reading a text and you're imputing your own meaning into the text. And it's very easy to do that if you're operating under the assumption that each author of the Bible was coming from the same perspective and was ultimately arguing for the same kind of theology. Because what happens then is that, say you read the Gospel of Mark, and you understand what the Gospel of Mark is saying to you, but then you go and read the Gospel of John. If you assume that the author of the Gospel of Mark and the author of the Gospel of John are trying to say the same thing, then you're essentially going to be reading the ideas of the author of the Gospel of Mark between the lines of the Gospel of John, and you can't possibly obtain an objective and clear understanding of what each author was trying to say if you have that kind of lens. And of course, people within Christianity approach these texts with all kinds of presuppositions anyway. If they were raised in a Calvinist background, for example, they're going to be reading these texts with a Calvinist lens, whether or not the author of any given text actually supported the claims of Calvinism. And so it's very important to understand that the Bible, while we may call it a book, it is actually a compilation of books that were for the most part written by different authors, and those authors had, in some cases, very different ideas about the subjects they were talking about. And so when you're reading the text of the Bible, even though they're contained alongside other texts, you've got to read them as if they were in isolation, because the authors of these texts had no idea whatsoever that their text would one day be contained in a collection of works that we call the Bible. They had no conception of that. In fact, in most cases, they weren't writing scripture as far as they knew. For example, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul wrote the majority of the New Testament. His works consist primarily of, or exclusively of, letters that he sent to different churches. And the Apostle Paul had no idea in the first century that he was writing what would one day be considered scripture. When he writes to the Ephesians, for example, he's just writing to the church in Ephesus to give them instruction in different matters. The Apostle Paul had no way of knowing that one day this work would be gathered up and put in a collection called the Bible, and people would read this whole his works and every other work in here as if they were expressing the same theology. That never occurred to any of the authors of these books. So while I'm going to primarily focus on the New Testament in this video, which is a big enough subject by itself, I will say a little about the Old Testament canon, if you will. For the most part, Jews agreed that the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or what we call the Old Testament, which is actually the Hebrew Bible, the first 5 books were to be regarded as scripture. There was very little dispute among Jews about that, but there was a lot of dispute regarding every other book in the Old Testament as we have it today. Of course, this is a Protestant Bible, 66 books. So the first 5 books of the Old Testament are called the Torah. You might also hear them referred to as the Pentateuch. And according to tradition, they were written by Moses himself. Hence, they are very highly regarded by primarily Jews, but also naturally Christians. Now, before we get into how the text of the New Testament came to be in the New Testament, you really have to understand the Christian milieu of the early centuries following the death of Christ. And I don't want to get into debates about the historicity of Jesus. That's a separate subject. In fact, if you look in my religion playlist, I did a video about that previously. I can't remember what I said, but I'm sure it was wonderful. I have to trust my past self. When you're a content creator, you have to trust your past self. Even I forget what I said in my videos like 2 days after I've made them, so I have to trust my past self that it was all great, I'm sure. But yeah, so I'm not going to get into debates about the historicity of Jesus, but in the centuries following the death of Jesus, whether you want to accept the historicity of it or not, despite what mainstream Christianity, for the most part, would have you believe, the Christian milieu was a very complicated one. There were all kinds of communities that had all kinds of ideas about what Jesus taught exactly, what the purpose of his life was, and so people came up with all kinds of what are called Christologies, which are ideas about the nature and purpose of Christ and things of that nature. So early Christianity was extremely diverse in terms of ideas about Christ and about everything else related to that tradition. Jesus himself had no conception that he was creating a new religion called Christianity. Jesus himself was a Jew, and so if Christianity hadn't got the grip that it eventually did on the Roman Empire, it would have been just one more Jewish sect, which is not to be dismissive of it, it's not to downplay it, that's just a historical reality, I would say. So early Christians had a very diverse set of viewpoints. And I think most people know that in the early centuries of Christianity, various councils were held to really settle the issue in various different ways. And so when it comes to how our New Testament came to contain the books that it does, I think most people just naturally assume, understandably so, that at some point in the early centuries there was some council held that said, okay, these books belong in the New Testament. These books are canon, and these other books are not. Because the diverse communities that I just talked about, they were producing all kinds of works. All around the Mediterranean era, you had different Christian communities producing all kinds of works, from the works that are now regarded as, well, that are officially canonical by virtue of being in the Bible, to works that didn't make it into the Bible, like the Apocalypse of John, which is like a Gnostic work. So all kinds of works cropping up, and these works were making their way around the Mediterranean area. And the reason we have them today is that, say, the Apostle Paul, I mentioned his letter to the Ephesians. So the Apostle Paul writes to Ephesus, and the Ephesians get his letter, and because they regard the Apostle Paul highly, they'll make copies of that letter, and those letters will gradually spread to other communities and so forth. That's how we end up with the New Testament scriptures that we have today. But of course, not every text that was written pertaining to Jesus made it into canon. So the question is why? And most people would understandably suppose that at some point there was a council that said, okay, these books are canon, these books are not. In fact, that's not what happened. The closest council of that nature, I would say, was the Council of Trent. But the Council of Trent didn't take place until the mid-16th century. Prior to that, there was never really a council that decided what was canon and what wasn't, despite what you might hear. For some reason, I hear a lot of people say that it was the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD that decided which books should be in the Bible and which books shouldn't. That is completely untrue. We know exactly what happened at the Council of Nicaea, and it had very little to do with Scripture. The primary issue of the Council of Nicaea was the nature of Christ. Was Christ God? Was he man? Somewhere in between. That was the Christology was the main focus of the Council of Nicaea at 325 AD. And that was at the height of something called the Arian controversy, where you had a theological dispute between a man called Arius and a guy called Athanasius. They were the primary figures in this. And Athanasius won the day eventually, although arguably not through consensus, but that's a separate subject really. But there was never such a council in the early centuries as far to decide what the canon of the New Testament was. That's not to say that no early figure ever commented on which books should be taken seriously and which shouldn't, because there certainly were. The church fathers talk about the books they approve of and the books they don't approve of, but they kind of work backwards. And if you reading the church fathers from a modern perspective, from the perspective of someone who probably understands critical thinking and is very analytical, and you approach things with a certain kind of logic, the logic of the church fathers is often highly questionable, because they tend to work backwards in the sense that the way they judge whether a text should be considered official or not, whether it should be taken seriously or not, is whether or not it agrees with their own personal theology for the most part, rather than, for example, trying to understand, who wrote this text. Does it have a direct line back to the apostles, for example, back to the disciples of Jesus? That came later. Their primary concern was, does this text fall into alignment with my own personal theology, which is a highly questionable way to look at things. But this is why I said earlier that the more I learned about the history of Christianity and Christian theology and how Christianity came to be the way it is today, the harder I found it to retain any kind of perspective that would be regarded as orthodox at all. So in the end I thought, well, why bother? So there was never an early council, but the church fathers did talk about it. Now the Council of Trent, the Council of Trent, you've got to understand, was a Roman Catholic council specifically. It was a Roman Catholic council, and it was primarily convened to address the problem of Protestantism at the time. What they saw as the problem of Protestantism. But it was, in the Council of Trent, they did talk about the books of the New Testament and which books should be considered canonical and which books shouldn't be. But the thing is that by the time the Council of Trent came about in the mid-16th century, the New Testament basically already existed in the form we have it today. It was basically largely agreed upon that these are the books that should be in the New Testament. So how did that come about? Well, quite simply, the books that came to be considered New Testament canon, they were Catholic. Not in the Roman Catholic sense, but in the literal sense of the word, which means universal. So basically, the more widespread a text became, like the Apostle Paul's letters, for example, they were very, very widespread. The more widespread a text contained, the more likely it would be that they would end up in the New Testament canon. They would come to be accepted by Christians by and large as being authoritative works. Whereas if you had a text that was unique to one little community of Christians somewhere around the Mediterranean, it was very unlikely that text was going to make it there. But that's not to say that every church agreed. That there were differences. The Ethiopian church had significant differences in their canon. But by the time of the Council of Trent, most Christians, bearing in mind you're talking 1,500 years after the life of Christ, most Christians had come to a broad consensus that the books that we have in the New Testament now should be in the New Testament. But in those early centuries, there were certainly fierce debates about certain texts. Gospel of John was one of them. The Gospel of John was highly contentious, because, as anyone who's read the four Gospels knows, it stands apart from the Synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic just means of the same line or of the same view. Hence, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the Synoptic Gospels because they are clearly recounting the same ministry. They're just embellishing different details and so forth. And Matthew and Luke are basically derived from Mark. And there's a hypothetical source called Q, which scholars believe was probably just a list of sayings by Jesus that also informed the Synoptic Gospels. But the Gospel of John is something else altogether. It's impossible to reconcile certain aspects of the Gospel of John with certain details of the Synoptic Gospels, and so that naturally caused the early church a lot of trouble. So the Gospel of John was one book that was heavily disputed. The Epistle to the Hebrews was another book that was heavily disputed. The Epistle to the Hebrews, a lot of Christians these days will say that it was written by the Apostle Paul. I would argue against that. I would say with 99.9% certainty that the Apostle Paul did not write the book of Hebrews. It's not his writing style at all. Literature is my strength, and I would bet money that the Apostle Paul did not write the book of Hebrews or the Epistle to the Hebrews. 2 Peter, people were very skeptical of 2 Peter. Many church fathers outright called it a forgery. And scholars today would certainly agree with that, although they'd say the same thing about 1 Peter as well. So 2 Peter was one a lot of people did not like at all. Revelation, the book of Revelation was another one that was hotly disputed in the early church, just because it seems to present so much more a violent perspective on God than the rest of the New Testament does, although it ultimately made it into canon, obviously. So there are books that are in our New Testament today that were disputed and they might not have made it. The book of Revelation, above all, I would say. 2 Peter, a close second. But by the time of the Council of Trent, it was basically all agreed. And Martin Luther, he had his own ideas. He was not a fan, for example, of the book of James, mainly because Martin Luther had this real emphasis on faith over works, that faith saves you and you can't be saved by works. And the book of James, tends to... Martin Luther felt that James contradicted that perspective. And again, that's a whole issue, that's a whole different subject I could get into. So as to the works that very nearly made it into the New Testament but didn't, well, okay, I'll put it this way. Let's say that knowing what I know now about the history of all these different texts and the history of how the New Testament came about, if I could create my own New Testament, what books would I remove and what books would I add in? Well, honestly, I'd probably take out 2 Peter as well. I mean, it almost certainly wasn't written by Peter, but that doesn't make it useless. It doesn't make it a useless book. But I wouldn't have 2 Peter. Here's what I would include. There's a work called the Didache, aka the Teaching of the 12, supposed to be the teaching of the 12 apostles. That's a work that I find very consistent with New Testament theology overall. And it directly addresses certain things that no other text in the Bible does. Abortion, for example, is never directly mentioned in the biblical text, not Old Testament, not New Testament. The Didache does mention it. The Shepherd of Hermas seems to me a very benign text, and again, largely in line with the overall theology of the New Testament. First Clement, maybe. First Clement was a work that could easily have made it into the New Testament, but didn't, for reasons that I won't go into here and that are largely lost to us anyway. But of course, I would add works that most people would not agree with. I would add, for example, the Gospel of Thomas. Now, the reason most people would never agree to add the Gospel of Thomas to the New Testament is because it's regarded as a Gnostic gospel. But is it a Gnostic gospel? Well, it undoubtedly contains elements of Gnosticism, undoubtedly, but it doesn't express a full-fledged Gnosticism. At the time the Gospel of Thomas was written, and we don't know exactly when that was, but it's very clear to me that Gnosticism had not developed into the Byzantine, did not have the kind of Byzantine cosmology and theology that it would ultimately develop. Sure, so the Gospel of Thomas has Gnostic elements, but they're very slight. is a very primitive form of Gnosticism, and crucially, and perhaps controversially, I would argue, no more so than the Gospel of John. As far as I'm concerned, and this was a concern in the earlier church as well, the Gospel of John is kind of a proto-Gnostic gospel. It has elements that a Gnostic, a Gnostic could read the Gospel of John and not have much problem with it at all. So that's why I feel that the Gospel of Thomas, if you're going to include the Gospel of John in the text of the New Testament, I don't see any reason not to include the Gospel of Thomas. Of course, I'm not looking at this in the same way that a mainstream Christian would. The way I look at all sacred texts is, there's only one question that matters. Do they benefit you? Do they benefit your spiritual life? The reason I would include the Gospel of Thomas is not primarily for any historical reasons. It's because I think it's a wonderful text. I think it's one of the most enlightening sacred texts you will ever read. That's why I went to the trouble of doing my own version of the Gospel of Thomas, because I felt that the existent translations, they didn't really convey the Gospel clearly in modern English, because they were done like in the latter half of the last century, and so the translations their wording tended to be very stifled, very formal, and so I felt there needed to be a translation that more clearly conveyed what I believe the author of the Gospel of Thomas was trying to convey. So I'd include them in there, and so that's what I'd have in the New Testament. There's no reason not to include the Didache. Shepherd of Hermas, no reason not to include it. First Clement, harmless. Like most Christians, if they were to read the Didache, the Shepherd of Hermas, and like First Clement, they wouldn't have a problem with it. But I would also include the Gospel of Thomas. I just question the wisdom of having any kind of canon at all. I question the wisdom of having this perspective where you say to people, these are the books that are acceptable and these are the books that are not. That's a very religious perspective to have. And as I said at the beginning of this video, there's a reason I draw a distinction between spirituality and religion. Spirituality is more free-form than that. So I say that go and look at not just the scriptures of the Bible, but all the more obscure texts as well, the ones that didn't make it into the Bible. And if you get something out of them, then great. If you don't, then you don't. It's really as simple as that. That's the only sensible way to approach this, as far as I'm concerned. So that leads us on to the Gospel of John, and this is where I'm going to conclude. And then tomorrow on my Patreon account, I'll do my first installment of the Gospel of John. Now, when I did my commentary on the Gospel of Luke, I did multiple chapters per video. I think when it comes to the Gospel of John, one, because it's my favourite Gospel, and two, because I'm extremely pressed for time, I think I'll just do one chapter per video, which is fine by me because I think it should be savoured. So let's talk about the Gospel of John. As I said earlier, it does stand distinct from the Synoptic Gospels in terms of its character, in terms of its narrative, and arguably in terms of its theology. And that's why so many in the early church had a problem with it. But I agree with Clement of Alexandria on this. See, Clement of Alexandria, he famously called the Gospel of John a spiritual gospel. And that nails it right there. That nails what the Gospel of John is all about. And this is where I think that modern scholars get it wrong. Primarily because they are looking at it from a scholarly, secular perspective. So what modern scholars will say about the Gospel of John is that, for the most part, this is the consensus, is that the Gospel of John was a product of a community of individuals. Not one individual, but a community of individuals. And that community would have been aware of the Synoptic Gospels, but they had their own theological ideas. And so in writing the Gospel of John, what they essentially cynically did is that they put their ideas into the mouth of Jesus, to have Jesus express their ideas, which again is a very cynical thing to do. I don't look at it that way at all. I don't think that the author of the Gospel of John expected people and I agree that the author of the Gospel of John was aware of the Synoptic Gospels, but I don't think he wanted people to read his Gospel and take it as historical fact in contradiction to the Synoptic Gospels. This is why I agree with Clement that the Gospel of John is a spiritual Gospel, in the sense that it's largely metaphorical. The authors or the authors of the Gospel of John understood that the historical facts surrounding the life and the ministry of Jesus had already been conveyed through the Synoptic Gospels. What the author or authors of the Gospel of John wanted to do was convey high spiritual theological truth through their Gospel. I don't believe they were, in writing their Gospel, they were suggesting an alternate history. Because what you find with the Gospel of John, in the Synoptic Gospels, you have all kinds of redundant verses where Jesus travels from here to here, and it's just so the narrative can get from point A to point B. But in the Gospel of John, even those parts where Jesus is traveling, and if those occurrences happened in the Synoptic Gospels, you just kind of brush past them. There's so much significance in almost every line of the Gospel of John that there's no way, in my mind, the author was just trying to recount some kind of history. His work was a deeply spiritual, deeply metaphorical work. And perhaps that's the reason it did end up in the New Testament, because perhaps people did recognize that. People like Clement of Alexandria, that this is not a gospel to take at face value in the way you're supposed to take the Synoptic Gospels at face value. So all these debates about how you reconcile the details of John with details from one or more of the Synoptic Gospels, really missing the point, because the Gospel of John is not trying to recount historical details in those ways. It's trying to convey theological, spiritual truth. And so that's what's vitally important to understand about the Gospel of John. And so I really had to make this video and share these understandings. I think these understandings will be very useful to a lot of people. That's why I want to make this kind of introductory video public, as opposed to just on my Patreon account. So it was necessary that I explain something of the nature of the Bible itself, the history of Christianity, the New Testament, so that I could then end this video talking about the nature of the Gospel of John before tomorrow on my Patreon account, God willing, I begin my commentary on same. So that's it. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. If you support me on Patreon, then I will see you tomorrow. If not, then I will see you on Monday for my next public video.